interviews with over 100 sort of current and former Black sisters. Indeed, I asked one sister what she thought the greatest legacy of Black sisters in the United States was, and she said, "It's easy. We made the church Catholic. It would not have been Catholic without us." And I think that we have to remember that there were members of the church who always understood that those things had no place, and we have to tell those stories. Because the church has been a site of, wonderful work, but also sort of a clear understanding of what freedom was and sort of an understanding of universal freedom. And it was being lived out in ways in which I don't think many of us know. And you certainly can't tell the story of any Black Catholic sisters in the United States without telling the story of the history of racial segregation and exclusion in the church and female religious life. I think one story that really stands out to me is the story of Sister Cora Marie Billings. Sister Cora Marie Billings was the first African-American accepted into the Religious Sisters of Mercy in Philadelphia. She is one of many African-American sisters who can trace their lineage to the earliest days of the church. Her ancestors were among those Catholic faithful who were enslaved by the church, who built the earliest sort of convents and seminaries and whatnot. And so her family's extraordinary journey from slavery to freedom in the Catholic Church is one that I think is worth remembering. So to say a little bit about her aunts, and we'll go back. So she sort of breaks a major barrier in 1956, but she had two aunts who were also educated in Philadelphia's Catholic schools, who were also called to religious life and who served and persevered in religious life. They entered religious life in the 1940s. Now, at that time, most communities in the United States and Philadelphia would not accept African-American women solely on the basis of race. Her aunts were rejected admission into every Catholic sisterhood, white sisterhood ministering in the city, and were forced to go into the nation's historically Black orders, which had been founded first in the 19th century in response to these exclusionary admissions policies of the nation's historically white communities. So both of her aunts became members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, which were the first successful community, Roman Catholic sisterhood for African-descended women, not only in the United States, but in the Western world. They remained in that community until their death. Moving back, their father was John Aloysius Lee Sr. Now, he was actually the second African-American to graduate from Catholic high school in Philadelphia, which is the nation's first Catholic high school. He was actually the first African-American to play in the basketball league. There's an amazing story from 1902 when he was put on the team, and then various other teams across Philadelphia threatened to leave the league if he was not removed from the team. And his teammates sort of stood up and said, if Johnny Lee doesn't play, we don't play. And so the sort of league backed down. He's such an important figure. He was a prominent layman. He received every sort of award, but in many ways sort of was one of the founder of many of the African-American sort of sports leagues in the city of Philadelphia. Now, his father, William Henry Lee, was one of the slaves who worked at Georgetown University. So they migrated. He worked for both the Jesuit fathers, but also for the Visitation Sisters during slavery. And then after slavery, he moved his family and brought them to Philadelphia, sort of following that track of many African Americans to sort of leave sort of that center of slavery to move somewhere else. And so it's an amazing sort of story of a family to think about that faithfulness, that uncommon faithfulness that arguably sort of characterizes the African American Catholic experience. And Sister Cora Marie, even though her aunts are not able to break that barrier in Philadelphia, right, it is the granddaughter and the great-granddaughter of this enslaved man who was able to break this barrier in Philadelphia. And then she goes on to break so many other barriers. She's the first African-American sister to teach in an archdiocesan high school. She actually desegregates the faculty of a Catholic school in Levittown right after the rebellions, after the first African-American family moves there. She's the foundress of the National Black Sisters Conference. She does so many things, but I also say that she's also the first African-American sister to be appointed to lead a Catholic parish. She is appointed in 1990. And so it is a family. I mean, in many ways, she sort of made a career out of breaking barriers in the church. But I think her family's story sort of illustrates a very long tradition of Black Catholicism that we generally don't think about, right? That story reminds us that there are two transatlantic stories of American Catholicism, one that begins in Europe and one that begins in Africa. And the one that begins in Africa is very long and arguably longer and perhaps will be longer than the transatlantic story that begins in Europe. And so I think it's one important story to tell too, because so often we think of Black Catholics only as converts, but to remember that there is this strong sort of history of cradle Catholicism within the African American community that deserves to be amplified. In my own work, I argue that Black sisters are the forgotten prophets of American Catholicism and democracy. We have so many examples of these women. To even think about someone like Anne Marie Beecraft, who was an Oblate Sister, who became an Oblate Sister of Providence later in her life, but her name is being amplified now as a result of Georgetown University's ongoing efforts to reconcile with their slaveholding past. And so I think what's really important about the story of Anne Marie Beecraft as this prophet, she is deciding to stay in the United States and claim her space as a right for African American women and girls to be educated in the church. She doesn't go into religious life until much later, but that's in part because she's not allowed to go into any communities. She's sort of founding this school before the Oblate Sisters of Providence are organized, and then finally she's able to sort of transfer her school over to another lay woman in the community, and then she enters into the community. And what we know is that they were planning on making her their superior, and then she dies very young. But we have these women who understood that racism had no place in the church, right? That they declare themselves, they claim space for themselves, that they fought to make the church truly Catholic. We have those examples, but we have examples of Black sisters during the Jim Crow period, desegregating Catholic colleges and universities before the Brown period because they have to get their schools accredited. And church law and mandates say that all Catholics must be educated in Catholic schools, but there was a time in which Catholic universities would not accept African Americans, even sisters. And so they have to appeal to the Vatican to get them to put pressure on university officials to open their doors. We have so many examples of these women, but I think at the heart of it, these are women who understood that racism had no place in the Catholic Church and who were fighting with every breath of their being to ensure that the church would be open. And what it reminds us is that that story is not only central in their stories, it's also central in the stories of white sisters, that we cannot avoid those kinds of topics if we are invested in racial reconciliation. Reconciliation comes from truth-telling. Truth-telling will lead to justice, and justice will lead to reconciliation. But reconciliation cannot come first. I would make the argument.